Good evening, everybody. I'm so pleased to see such a nice crowd for the first evening of this semester. Couldn't be, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. Now you can, yes. Welcome to the 16th edition of the Myra Kraft Open Classroom. As many of you know, many of you who are loyal followers know, we began this, Barry Bluestone, the founding dean of our school. Barry, stand up and take an accolade. Barry, by the way, is actually on leave this semester, and so is not teaching, but he'll be here next week, so we'll grab him a few times anyway.
You needed at least one Trump supporter, so.
Oh, there you go. And as many of you know, the series began in the spring of 2008 when Barry and Paul Grogan at the Boston Foundation did a course on the 21st century city, if I recall. And rather than, and Barry can tell you this at length, but I won't let him. As you know, Barry said, well, rather than just have a class, let's open it up to the public and have speakers and everything. And we began that, and of course, it all just sort of has gone on from there. So this is literally the 16th edition, begun in the spring of 2008, and every semester since then we have done this. Different themes, but of course every 4 years the theme introduces itself. So it was no surprise when we decided to do this fall what we are going to do. Let me introduce myself quickly. I'm Christopher Bosso, professor of public policy here at Northeastern, a colleague of Barry's. And just so you know, this also is the 10th anniversary of the School of Public Policy Urban Affairs itself. So we're celebrating our 10th anniversary as a policy school. And Barry and I were there at the beginning and haven't aged a bit since then. So we welcome you to, again, the 10th anniversary of the school. This is the signature series of the school. The Myra Kraft Open Classroom, named after the late Myra Kraft, of course, the late wife of Robert Kraft. And by the way, I have to thank Paul Shue. Paul, where are you? Paul Shue sitting next to Barry. Paul was kind of a frequent attendee of the Open Classroom. Has given us a cake for the Myra Kraft. He says, Myra Kraft rocks. So thank you very much, Paul. I'd love to say we're going to spread it around to the audience, but the university frowns upon eating in this room, and we don't have any forks anyways, but we'll figure out a way to deal with it. So, Kitty, you're taking it home. And there you go. The theme this semester is, as it's quite clear, the choice, election 2016. The theme suggested itself, but we thought that there was no better opportunity to really explore deeply, how we got to where we got to this year with this presidential election, the candidates, how they got to where they are, the two parties, the choices confronting the American electorate as we approach this momentous election. I mean, every 4 years is a major election in American politics, but this one has a different feel to it. It's a very, given what's happening in the world, given a lot of the events, both in the United States and globally, this has the mark of an important election. So we thought we would explore really the choices facing the American electorate in this election campaign, the choices between, not just posed by the two candidates, but by the two parties, by others. And then after the election, whatever happens, we'll have a retrospection on the Obama presidency over the last 8 years. So I'm not going to go through the entire structure of the semester right now. We want to get into the main event. But let me just say that next week, we'll dive into the very first, the important themes of the election, the topics. We're going to intersperse our themes this semester with some process stuff, like the election system itself. How did we get these two candidates? Media coverage, down ballot elections, what's going on in the states, what's going on in Massachusetts this year on the ballot initiatives. We're going to intersperse those process things. I'm a political scientist, so I love process. We're going to intersperse process with the topics, the themes, the issues that we're confronting the electorate. So we're going to have a lot of fun this semester, I hope. Some general housekeeping items, just for those of you who are new here. The structure of the evening will be relatively simple. We'll spend the first hour with our guest speakers, each doing roughly 15-20 minutes, ending around 7 o'clock. We're not going to take a break, so if you need to rush to the restrooms, just feel free to do so, and we won't feel bad about it. We're going to give that experiment. We're going to experiment with that this semester because I feel I want to see if that keep the rhythm going in some respects. So if you need to use the restrooms, you just go up the back and then around the back here, and the restrooms are located there. We won't feel bad if you get up and just go ahead and feel free. So that'll be the structure of the evening. The first half will be our formal presentations. The second half will be question and answer discussion. And here's the theme I want to set this semester. This really is an exploration. Where are we? How did we get here? What are the choices? What are the implications? The election of the President of the United States, especially in the 21st century, seems to weigh heavily not only on us in this nation, but also on the world. So, what are the choices we face? And how do we sort of look at them? Not just for, and especially, as we're going to see, for various generations of Americans. So we're going to be exploring different themes, different topics for different generations as we go through this semester. So that's the structure. That's what we're going to do. And tonight we're going to start out with, by the way, before we get going, for tonight, next week, the economy. We're going to look at the economy, jobs, and opportunity. We'll be joined by our friend Barry Bluestone and by our colleague from sociology, Steve Vallis, who will explore the macro changes in the economy, both here and globally, and then the meaning of work and how that's changed. And how has that fueled, in some respects, the populist reactions that we've seen not just in the United States, but also in the rest of the world, the rest of the industrialized world. So that'll be next week. I know we'll have a lot of fun with that. Tonight's theme, how did we get here? How did our two major party candidates attain their nominations? How has this seemingly interminable nomination process played out the way it did? And no matter who you like, who you don't like, how did we get to where we are today? And how do we get to the choices facing Americans today? So I'm joined tonight by three colleagues. The first, Rachael Cobb, colleague at Suffolk University, chair and associate professor at government at Suffolk University. Rachel's a specialist in elections, election administration, electoral politics, and civic engagement. And she focuses a lot on political participation. And she has a grant, and Rachael has done a lot of work on training people to be poll watchers, because as many of you know, poll watchers are increasingly retired people, and how do you train the next generation of poll watchers? And so Rachael spent a lot of her time training young people to become engaged as poll watchers, and has too far today trained 500 students in the Boston area to be poll watchers in the Boston area and elsewhere. So that's a tremendous achievement. In addition, of course, she's got scholarly achievements in publications in Quarterly Journal of Political Science, Studies in American Political Development, and other publications. And finally, she's a monthly contributor to The Scrum on NPR's Morning Edition with Adam Riley. She has her PhD from one of the schools across the river, MIT, and her bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr. So, did you go to Vassar? No, which one did you go to? One of those Philadelphia schools. Vassar. Well, Bill Miles was a Vassar.
Vassar was strictly women.
At the time you were there, yes. I get confused.
Say something. Why are there only 2 women on this board?
The board is not indicative of who's coming. The board are the candidates. We'll talk about that. I knew you would see that. Our second speaker tonight is Bill Mayer. 2 women who are candidates. The second speaker tonight is Bill Mayer, good friend and colleague here at Northeastern's Department of Political Science. Bill and I go back further than we care to admit. Bill teaches and does his research in areas including the presidential nominating process, election outcomes, and voting behavior. Among his recent publications include books like The Making of Presidential Candidates and The Swing Voter in American Politics. And recent articles include What, If Anything, Have We Learned from Presidential Election Forecasting? That's an interesting topic for political scientists. And Why Trump and How Far Can He Go? He's also a contributor of opinion pieces to newspapers like the Boston Herald and other media outlets. He earned both his bachelor's and PhD at the other place across the river, Harvard University. Finally, a person that needs no introduction, but I'll do so anyway. My good friend and colleague, Mike Dukakis, who has been a colleague here at Northeastern for 25 years now, Mike?
This is 26.
26? And I was here before him, so, I was 6 years old when I started. Yeah. Mike, of course, again, needs no introduction, former governor, presidential nominee of the Democratic Party in 1988, good colleague, and, by the way, a great teacher, starting up another semester, full load, full group of students, grades all of his own papers, still is a terror to undergraduates and graduates alike. And it's a delight to have Mike here. So what we're going to do is we'll have Rachael go first talk about the Democrats, how did Hillary Clinton get the nomination. Bill will follow up with the Republicans and how did Donald Trump get the nomination. And Mike, you want to come in and have some reflections about how this year compares to previous ones. And then we'll open it up. So Rachael, without further ado.
Sounds good. Thank you. I'm focusing on Hillary Clinton. My colleague will focus on Donald Trump. The overview for today has certainly been a doozy of and a long campaign. There have been many surprises, the success of Bernie Sanders, the rise of Donald Trump, and the national stage, the death of Antonin Scalia, setting the stage for a major Supreme Court battle, the tragic events in Orlando and Dallas and other cities across the country over the summer and the past few months, and the dramatic and painful and challenging times that we are now in. So this evening we address the question of why Clinton and why Trump. Given the magnitude and the negative ratings that both candidates have in the national polls, at first glance it seems surprising that two unpopular at times would win the votes, the money and the support of the millions in our own democracy. This evening, I address the question of Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee for president. So I'm going to proceed as follows, discussing this question. First, I want to go back to our presidential nomination system and just do a brief overview of Presidential Nominations 101. Then I want to talk about the role of parties in the political process and some recent political science scholarship that sheds light on it, and then discuss in more detail Clinton's path, and then offer a few concluding remarks. So we first discuss the question in theory of who decides who the nominee will be. Is it the party and the party leaders, or is it the voters via primary elections? So first, a little history. In the old days, in the time between the Progressive era and to 1968, it was during the Progressive era that presidential primaries were invented as part of a series of early 20th century reforms. The goal of primary elections in general was to take power outside of the hands of party leaders and give it to the voters. From the Progressive until 1968, the nomination process was really a two-stage process. The first was the primary election. However, primaries really were generally irrelevant. According to Elaine Kmark, who wrote a very good book called Primary Politics, more often than not, presidential candidates didn't even put their names on the ballots in the primaries. They were, she argues, largely out of it. But the second stage was the negotiation between candidates and party leaders. And this is where the candidates went and vied for the support of the leaders. They went to local party officials, they went to precinct leaders, they went to ward leaders, the county chairs, and the meetings and all of that, and that ultimately culminated in a state convention. And at the state convention, they chose a group to attend the national nominating convention. But power was concentrated, sometimes in the hands of big city mayors, sometimes in the hands of governors, sometimes in the hands of senators, who at times had sole discretion in selecting the delegates. And then 1968 happened. And in 1968, we had a series of very difficult events in the United States. The protest candidate, Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy, challenged incumbent President Lyndon Johnson. In New Hampshire primary, he nearly beat him. and his run prompted Robert Kennedy to enter the race. President Johnson, seeing the writing on the wall, announced that he would not seek re-election. This prompted his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, to declare his candidacy. And then 1968 unfolded even further, with the assassinations of Martin Luther King, the riots in American cities, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, and anger filled the air by the time of the Chicago Democratic National Convention, where police clubbed anti-war protesters. Hubert Humphrey became the nominee. He was the last candidate in the Democratic Party to be nominated under the old-fashioned way. He won the nomination on the first ballot. He entered 0 primaries. As the vice president, he inherited Johnson's delegates. 25% of the delegates had been chosen by 1967. Only 9 primaries during that year listed presidential candidates on the ballot at all. So the anti-war sentiment that had erupted in the country had little impact on the distribution of power into who the actual nominee for president would be. The anti-war activists claimed foul, and they claimed that the system was rigged. So the events of 1968 spurred reform. Following the convention, the McGovern-Fraser Commission was established. The Democratic National Committee made recommendations. And by 1972, we had a full transformation of the way we nominate the president within the Democratic Party, and the Republicans followed suit. Party caucuses went from being closed events to becoming open events. There was an increased number in binding primaries. Party caucuses in the convention system became by law, ultimately, in both parties, a fully public system. There was an increase in the number of binding primaries. In 1972, there were 21 primaries. In 2008, there were 42. In 1972, 20,000 Democrats turned out at the caucuses. In 2008, 227,000 people turned out. So that's the transformation that occurred between 1968 to now. On the Republican side, they appointed also a 16-member committee of delegates and organization, which they call the DO Committee. And they determined that primaries versus caucuses were the easiest to implement. So the consequences of reforms are twofold, and there were many critics at the time. One was that caucuses, all being held on the same day in a state, became a media event, and they also, over time, became highly attended. The other thing that happened was the front-loading of primaries and caucuses. And so states vied very quickly to want to get in the game as soon as possible because they wanted the attention, they wanted the people to be in their state, they wanted their state to make a difference. So the criticism of this system, most notably put forth by Nelson Polsby, was that it ultimately had the effect of weakening political parties, and that translated into a challenge ultimately for governance, and a challenge of the ability of governance to have coalitions. It displaced, he argued, the peer review process, which is what parties were involved in, party bosses were involved in, and the deliberation process, with a process of giving it to the most number of people. And he also argued that it rewarded candidates who mobilized factions rather than candidates who formed coalitions of governing elites. But recent political science scholarship has challenged that view of the criticism and has said that even if parties didn't have a ton of power in the sort of right after the McGovern-Fraser Committee, they quickly figured out how to game the system and how to have more power. And so a book that was written and published in 2008 by political scientists Marty Cohen, David Carroll, Hans Knoll, and John Zoller asserts that parties retain control of presidential nominations, especially in the period prior to actual voting, what they call the invisible primary. So we ask 3 questions. When does this happen? What takes place? And what is the result? Well, it occurs in that period preceding Iowa and New Hampshire and the beginning of voting. And what takes place is candidates going around the country, making speeches, fundraising, building coalitions, engaged in constant travel. And they are attempting to boost their name recognition, they are standing out from the field, they are connecting with party leaders across the country and trying to secure their support. And the result, they argue, is that actually the front runner is determined even before the voting begins, so that the party has coalesced around a certain individual. So who are these people and who do they determine if the party decides who is the party? Is it the chair of the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee? Is it interest groups and activists? What they say is that it is the group of people in the United States who they term intense policy demanders, factions within each party, interest groups and activists who unite behind a candidate via what they call signaling mechanisms. So what are these signaling mechanisms? Well, one of them is money. The person who's able to raise money, that's a signal that they are viable and can actually make it. The other one is endorsements. If they give their endorsement, they are signaling to other people that this person is like me, it's like us, they're in the in crowd. And so as we watch, there is what happens because of these endorsements that people are amassing and because of the money that they are amassing, there is a collective winnowing, and it ultimately focuses elite attention, it focuses voter attention, and it focuses the media attention. So, in this particular presidential election, this theory works out well. And we'll see how it works out on a Republican side. But on the Democratic side, the frontrunner did emerge early. She got endorsements. She got support in the polls, and she got money. In 2015, Hillary Clinton established an endorsement lead. She had, according to 538.com, a commanding lead in endorsements even before launching her campaign that was unprecedented for a non-incumbent Democrat. By April of 2015, the Los Angeles Times said she also had dramatic name recognition, which was no surprise, obviously, having been the former First Lady, a senator from New York, Secretary of State. She had all of that going for her. And because she had these endorsements and because she had the name recognition, this was a signal to other candidates who we might have expected to enter, particularly people like Joe Biden, that they were going to sit this one out because she had it wrapped up. She also earned, in January, the endorsement of Planned Parenthood. And then later she got, I'm going to go over all of these endorsements, but she had it from the Natural Resources Defense Council and unprecedented support from female donors. So then, where did this guy Bernie Sanders come from? And how was it that he was able to gain so much support, it seemed? Well, in Iowa, he did surprise many commentators and analysts and pundits and all of those folks with coming within 0.3 percentage points in the Iowa caucuses. And then he trounced her in New Hampshire. And he won 22 primaries and caucuses and amassed $225 million in campaign donations. And he won, as you look at the map, he won all of the green states, and Hillary Clinton won all of the yellow states. She earned 3 million more votes than he did, with 55.2% to his 43.1. But by all accounts, he did do well. They had somewhat different office-holding experience. They were in the Senate together for 2 years. And during that time, they had very similar ideological positions, voting in the same way 93% of the time. But they did differ on some biggies, including foreign policy, immigration, where she supported the Immigration Reform Bill of 2007 and he opposed it, and the bank bailouts, she supported them and he opposed them. But she had the endorsement in everything. She had 523 points compared to his 13. So what does this points mean? This is on Nate Silver's website. He's been keeping track of all of the endorsements. And he allots points to the kind of endorsement that you get. So if you have an endorsement from a member of the United States House of Representatives, you get 1 point. If you have an endorsement from a US Senator, you get 5. And if you have an endorsement from a governor, you get 10. Am I allowed to ask my audience questions? Why do you think it is that a governor would have double the points of a senator? Yes?
Well, governors control the state parties. So I would think that a governor would have more control over their party's movement and turnout in the state.
Precisely. So it is the case that governors are able to mobilize that machine. And so those endorsements make a big difference to the ability of a candidate to be able to get ahead. And if we track over time current candidates and past nominees, you can see she's the dark blue line. She had the endorsements compared to all of the other Democratic presidential candidates, well ahead of schedule. And we can actually, it's kind of cool, so I'll just take a moment. You can actually track these over time. I don't know if anybody can see it, but if you go down here, can you see? Or is it so tiny you can't see? So you can track the number of endorsements over time compared to other Democratic presidential candidates. And you see that growing over time. All right. She also earned the support not only of elected representatives, but also the endorsements of interest groups. And he only got a few, she got quite a few. And this is just a chart showing the kinds of support that she got and when she got it. She was getting support from senators very early on, the 618 is 6/18/2015, and then from Claire McCaskill, and then from Barbara Boxer in October, from Charles Schumer in November, Patty Murray at the end in November as well, versus Bernie Sanders, who it was not until late 2015 that he started to pick up the endorsements. Joe Biden and Martin O'Malley did not get hardly any in comparison. She also raised quite a bit of money, and by June, by the first FEC report, she had $47.5 million in the bank. Bernie Sanders caught up in the second quarter, but by the end, she had raised far more money than Bernie Sanders. Now, the final analysis is so after all of this invisible primary, after all of this support, after all of this money and all of that, what happened when the voters actually voted? And the data that we have is from the exit polls. We have exit polls from 24 primary and caucus states from early February through the end of April 2016. And we found that among liberals, Sanders outperformed Clinton by about 9 points. However, Clinton outperformed Sanders by 11 points among women, by 18 points among non-whites, and by Democrats by 28 points. So he was earning the support of independents and people who were less connected to their policy positions, and she was earning the support of the base of the Democratic Party. My colleagues at Princeton University, Christopher Aiken and Larry Bartels, have written a little bit about this, and arguing that the differences in performances reflect the people who were supporting them, their social identities, their symbolic commitments, and their partisan loyalties. They found evidence from the 2016 National Election Survey pilot that Sanders supporters were less likely than Clinton supporters to favor key policies Sanders advocated, including higher minimum wage, increasing government spending on health care, and the expansion of government services through higher taxes. So in conclusion, the main takeaways are that Clinton earned the support of the Democratic Party and what the Democratic Party represented very early on. And this sequential revelation of preferences of party elites early on signaled to other candidates that they needed to sit it out. Sanders, on the other hand, failed to expand his outsider appeal to the key groups within the Democratic Party base. And Clinton won, therefore, by crafting that coalition of social group constituencies and a clearly defined approach to governance. So I will turn the mic over.
Let me start by making a prediction in an unpredictable year, which is that this is an election that political scientists, historians, and journalists will be studying for decades to come. And the question they will ask is very much the one that Chris raised: how did we get here? It is no exaggeration to say that the two major party candidates we have this year are probably the two most generally unpopular politicians in America. If the Democrats had nominated anybody besides Hillary Clinton, they would be trouncing the Republicans. And if the Republicans had nominated virtually anybody besides Donald Trump, they would be trouncing the Democrats. And somehow or other, the voters will have to decide between two candidates, both of whom are viewed unfavorably by substantial majorities of the public. Well, I'm going to be trying to explain the Republican half of that. And I should open by saying that, like most pundits and most political scientists, I did not see this one coming. I was not terribly surprised when on June 16th, 2015, Donald Trump announced that he was running for president. As more and more presidential debates are held before the first primary, and as more of these debates are nationally televised, we've gradually begun to produce a set of candidates who enter the presidential race not because they have a realistic chance of winning, but because it's a good career move. They get a boatload of free publicity, and if they weren't running for president, it's not clear what else they'd be doing. So it was no great surprise that Donald Trump, who, we've learned nothing else, absolutely craves publicity. It was no surprise, I think, that he decided to get into the race. And since the early presidential polls don't measure much besides name recognition, I wasn't surprised when the first national poll, after he announced, found that he had the support of about 11% of Republican identifiers. What was surprising was what happened after that. That he gained a lot of support and held it quite firmly in spite of everything else that was going on in the nomination race. By July 20th, according to Real Clear Politics website, which does a nice service for people like me of kind of averaging the polls, which has the effect of filtering out the outliers and giving you a general sense of the race. By July 20th, it was on July 20th when Trump first took over the lead in the Republican nomination, but even then he only had 17% of party identifiers. By early August, he was up to 24. He declined a bit in September, but in mid-November, he was starting to go back up, and by the end of the year, he was up to 36%. And his nearest competitor at the time was Ted Cruz, who had 19%. So he clearly had emerged as the front runner in the race, and to make a long story short, he had built up a head of steam that proved impossible to stop. Let me give you just a few, few summary statistics here. This just shows how many primaries and caucuses the various candidates won. And notice how Trump absolutely dominated in the primaries. Ted Cruz actually won a majority of the caucuses, but there aren't that many states that hold by bottom line, of course, was that Trump won substantially more delegates. In terms of total primary votes, we don't have caucus, I don't have firm caucus numbers, though. If I did, it wouldn't change these things much. Notice Trump won about 45% of the vote. His nearest competitor won just 25%. Just one other comparison here. Notice that though he did win 45%, that's rather low for a recent Republican nominee. In fact, it's the lowest of all of the candidates since 1980, though it's only fair to say he's not that much below John McCain in 2008. Now, why did Trump assemble this following? Why did he win the nomination? Well, at this point, and I probably should have warned Chris about this in advance, I have something of a handout.
I knew you would do this.
And I hope there's enough of these. You might want to sort of share, but I did print out about 100 of them, so there's something close to it. Let me just say, if you don't get one and you want to scrutinize one more closely, email me here. And I'll send you a copy. Let me hope I can take 10 seconds here to just let people. Well, but I want them to look at the tape before I start talking about it. How are we doing? Not enough for people up there? Okay, well, if you take a look at those of you who have one, and the rest of you, if you take a look at it in a second. One of the things you might notice is that Trump actually assembled a fairly diverse coalition, though it should be said a diverse coalition of Republicans. That's rather, this is an electorate that is, about 93% white, something like that. Demographically, though, he won a plurality of most groups. And the differences, by and large, that do exist between the demographic groups are not all that strong. So, for example, Trump did do better among men than among women, but he won a plurality of the votes cast in Republican primaries by women. Contrary to some reports, I remember reading a number of a couple of stories that said he was winning because he had the evangelical vote. Actually, he did win a plurality of the votes cast by evangelicals, but he did slightly better among non-evangelicals. Perhaps the factor that most sharply distinguishes Trump from non-Trump voters is education. He did best among those candidates who had a high school degree or less, but notice that he also won a narrow plurality of those with a postgraduate education. Contrary to another claim I've heard some Republicans say that what they want to do for 2020 is to remodel the process to keep independent voters out of Republican primaries on the thought that that was how Trump won by flooding Republican primaries with independents. Actually, Trump did slightly better among Republicans than among independents. Now, one pattern, if you go to the back of the handout, one pattern that clearly does stand out is the reason that voters gave for supporting the various candidates. Few voters claimed that Trump shared my values. Just 14%, in fact. That was the one thing that helped Ted Cruz a good deal. Trump did best among those who thought that he could bring change, and even more, those who wanted a candidate who would, quote, tell it like it is. There clearly is visible in this a reaction against political correctness. And lots of people that at least I saw interviewed would often talk about how they liked Trump because he was saying things they had always felt that most other politicians were afraid to say. I suspect that's a minority opinion in the electorate as a whole, but it clearly attracted support from a lot of Republicans. You might note also some of the limitations of Trump's rivals that you can see in this survey. I don't know if I mentioned what this handout is. It does say it, but I should clarify just a little. I took the results of 24 exit polls as they were reported on CNN, and basically averaged the results across, weighted by state turnout. So a state that has, say, 1 million voters in its primary gets 20 times the weight of a state that only has 50,000. So this is essentially what you would get if all of the primaries were held on the same day and you took a kind of national exit poll. And I was going to say about Cruz, notice that he does win those. Cruz clearly had a strategy here that was, I will portray myself as the most conservative person in the race. That historically, that has not actually been a winning strategy in the Republicans, but that was Cruz's idea. And you'll note he did win a plurality of those who said they were very conservative. But he never broke outside that box. He did substantially less well among those who said they were somewhat conservative, and among the approximately fifth of Republican primary voters who said they were moderates, he got just 15%. Similarly, he made a big deal of his religious attachments, and again did well among born-again or evangelical Christian voters, not so well among those who were not born-agains. I mean, that's at least a description of the electorate and their motives, but it still raises the question, why did Trump do so well? And to focus the question I'm asking here just a bit, especially if Trump loses, and I think if you had to bet right now, you'd probably say that, though, as I said, this has been a very difficult year to predict. But especially if Trump loses, Republicans will need to ask themselves exactly why he was nominated and what this says about their future. Is Trump just the first of a number of candidates who are going to do Trump-like things to win future nominations? Or is he a fluke? Is he a perfect storm, a result of a whole series of coincidences that are unlikely to be repeated? And I have a mixed answer to that question. I think there are some things that help Trump that are long-standing problems for the Republican Party. I think there are some that were unique to Trump and suggest that some other candidate who has a similar sort of aspiration will find it hard to duplicate what he did. So just to go over some of the things that work to Trump's advantage. First of all, the Republicans have a long-standing fondness for political outsiders. And by outsiders, I mean not just those outside of Washington, but those entirely outside of politics. The only person who has done well in any recent Democratic nomination contest who had never been elected to office before was Jesse Jackson. By contrast, there's a fair number of Republicans who have done well, even if they've never won the nomination, who were political neophytes. Think of Steve Forbes in 1996. Think of Herman Cain, who actually was leading in the polls for a while before he withdrew from the race in 2012. Now, if Republicans have a fondness for outsiders, they have a particular fondness for business people. There is a belief among some Republicans, clearly, that politics doesn't work very well, and the way to cure it is if only we could get a business person to run the country. Speaking as somebody who teaches political science, I'm skeptical of that. But again, clearly, I'm in a rather, I have a minority viewpoint here, at least compared to the Republican electorate. Among other things, that explains how Trump can sit there and can talk about how he will cure all these problems immediately. If he had a record in government, some people would say, well, why haven't you done these sweeping transformations in office? As a business person, he can at least claim that he's been able to do it, whether his business record is, of course, a little more checkered than that, but that's a different story. Clearly, as a third factor, there is a dissatisfaction with the party leadership among a lot of Republican voters. To some extent, that probably represents a lack of progress in rolling back Obamacare and in reducing federal spending. The Republicans made a lot of promises about all the things they would get done if they could win back the Senate in 2014. They did, and haven't had too much to show for it. But I think there's a particular sense of grievance among Republican voters with the immigration issue. As is true on a lot of issues, the problem here goes back to George W. Bush, who, as you may remember, pushed for comprehensive immigration reform, even though it was clearly not popular with the Republican base. And I think just as much as his push for it was, in some ways, the rank dishonesty with which he pushed for it, claiming that immigrants, for example, would only take jobs that Americans wouldn't take, which he had no business guaranteeing that. Often claiming that he was making major efforts to stop illegal immigration, and I don't know anybody who really believed that. But this policy, the favorability towards this policy continued among party leaders after Bush left office. In the wake of the 2012 election, you may know that our Republican National Committee Chairman Reince Priebus appointed a committee, 5 people, to examine why Republicans lost and what they could do. They made in their final report a total of 1 policy recommendation, and that was that Republicans needed to embrace comprehensive immigration reform. Paul Ryan has similarly come out in favor of it. Jeb Bush, who, if there was any candidate in 2016 who was a symbol of the establishment, it was Jeb, famously said that illegal immigration was an act of love. He later sort of said, well, but I would try to enforce, secure the border, but I think lots of people believe that he was no more likely to do that than his brother had. So it's no coincidence, I think, that that was the issue that first attracted attention and support for Trump. You may remember that he came out in his nomination speech, or his announcement speech rather, and talked about how there were lots of criminals coming over the border, and I think a lot of people are sympathetic to that criticism. And we're delighted that finally one candidate was talking about such things. Now those are things that, as I say, are long-standing problems for the Republicans. Let me mention a couple that I think were more unique to this year. One is the celebrity factor. In every democracy that's ever been studied, most people don't pay a whole lot of attention to politics. So it is generally a big help to be well known, even if you are not well known for anything having to do with politics. That's why, for example, Bill Bradley got elected to the Senate from New Jersey, why Jack Kemp got elected to the House from a district around Buffalo. Quite a number of other sports stars who have been elected, Jim Bunning in the Senate in Kentucky, Tom Osborne to the House in Nebraska, and so forth. It's also why Kennedys and Bushes keep getting elected in various offices. Trump's business career, as I've already said, is, if you look at the details as opposed to what he will tell you in his speeches, is really rather checkered. A whole lot of failures connected with it. But one thing he is undeniably very good at is selling himself. I think it's fair to say that a non-celebrity Trump-like candidate would not have done as well. You may know that since Trump's nomination, there have been a number of candidates who have tried to run campaigns for the House and the Senate as sort of, I'm a local version of Trump, or I'm a state version of Trump, and they've been generally unsuccessful. For example, there was a candidate who ran against Paul Ryan in the Republican primary for a House district in Wisconsin, and Ryan beat him something like 85-9. And I think it just indicates that celebrity helps. Second, there clearly was a remarkable bias, if that's the right word, towards Trump in press coverage. Somebody made an estimate that about 2/3 of the way through the nomination process, Trump had received about $2 billion worth of free coverage on the network evening news, as compared to, for example, Hillary Clinton, who had received about $700 million, and I think the nearest Republican competitor had about $300 million. Now, a lot of that press coverage has been unfavorable, but they have gotten his name out there, and it's important to add that there are a lot of Republicans who, frankly, have come to the conclusion that the media cannot be trusted, that they are biased in favor of Democrats, biased against Republicans. There's quite a good deal of evidence to suggest there's some justice in that claim, at least in my opinion. In any event, the coverage may have been critical, but they spelled his name right, as the old saying goes. Another factor that was unique to this year was the large field of candidates. The mere fact that there were 17 of them meant that there was no obvious person to rally around when Trump broke out into a lead, no person to kind of unite the troops against him. Finally, Trump benefited from the other candidates' mistakes and weaknesses. I think it's fair to say that the 2016 group of Republican candidates, which at one point had been viewed as unusually good and talented, actually turned out to be much weaker than expected. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples of that. Going into the 2016 nomination race, I don't think any candidate was better positioned, than Marco Rubio. Senator from obviously a key swing state, had been elected with Tea Party support, Hispanic, and then he basically threw it all away when, for reasons that I still have never heard a good explanation for, he decided to sign on to an immigration bill called the Gang of Eight that was just massively viewed by the Republican base as providing amnesty to illegal immigrants and getting virtually nothing in return in the way of increased enforcement. It was a huge mistake on his part, and I'm still unclear as to why he did it. John Kasich, another guy who could have been well-positioned, governor of another swing state, had a very good record, at least among Republicans, and I think among some Democrats, when he was budget chairman in the House, had served on the House Armed Services Committee and therefore had a kind of foreign policy credential that a lot of the other candidates didn't. And then he made the very strange decision to campaign as a moderate, as kind of the resurgence of John Huntsman. In fact, both of them had the same campaign manager, positioning himself way outside what most Republicans wanted to vote for. Ted Cruz, just the final example, I've already suggested that he positioned himself not just as conservative, but as very, very conservative, and moreover, as a cranky and disagreeable conservative. So you add the mistakes together, and Trump had enough to carry him through the nomination. For most of the primary season, he was winning with less than 50% of the vote. But he had enough of it to get the nomination. And as I say, in any other year, he would be unelectable. But the Democrats nominated a candidate who also has a long list of problems, and we'll see who wins in the end. Thank you.
Well, it's a little past 7, and this second half of this is for you, not us. You've just heard 2 really terrific presentations. Welcome back, my pal and guy who put a lot of this together. Barry, great to see you. Look forward to listening to you next week. So let me just make a few observations, and then we're going to turn this over to you. It's obvious that the American electorate, or at least a large part of it, is not happy these days. Which is interesting in a way, because if you go back to 2008 and the election of 2008, this country was in big trouble. Serious unemployment in Wall Street was hysterical. GM was going bankrupt. Remember those days? And any objective observer looking at the U.S. of A today has to conclude that we appear to be in significantly better shape. Now, Kitty and I just came back from a week in Greece, some of which was recreational, but a good deal of which was political. And the folks over there, I mean, not just in Greece, but particularly in Greece, think that the U.S. is doing just great. In a point of fact, we are compared with Europe, and certainly with Southern Europe. And they don't understand, first, what this guy Trump is doing in American politics, and secondly, why he seems to have built significant popularity. And this is going to be, mark my words, folks, this is going to be a tough, competitive race here. So why are Americans unhappy? Or at least why are a substantial number of Americans unhappy? Well, for reasons that I think are familiar to many of you. Yes, we're doing better, the numbers look better, but it's spotty, it's sectional. Massachusetts, in a sense, is a kind of economic bubble of its own these days. And California, interestingly enough, is not far behind. And economic growth and job creation in California is growing very rapidly. It's large sections of the country, many of them formerly industrial, as all of us know, especially in the Midwest and in other places, where you've got a lot of discontent because, in point of fact, they aren't sharing in this apparent prosperity. Secondly, as I discovered very painfully in 1978, for those of you who remember that I was defeated when I first came back for re-election. You know, I ran in 74 at a time when this state was an economic basket case with the second highest unemployment rate in the country. We lived in New Appalachia and so on and so forth. And that's what people were calling us. And I felt pretty good in my 4th year as governor, my first term, when in point of fact an unemployment rate of 12%, 20 and 25% in many of our older urban communities was down to 5. And we were beginning to come back, and things looked good, and our fiscal problems were beginning to be resolved. And I was 40% in the polls against my primary opponent, Ed King, with 5 weeks ago. And the guy beat me. And it was only after that, thinking about it, and talking about folks, I realized, with the help of very many people, that the numbers may look good, folks, but when we've gone through what we went through in 2007, 2008, it takes a lot longer than just a few years to convince people that that conditions are that good. And for many Americans, they're not that good. And secondly, as I'm sure Bill and Rachael will tell you, the immigration issue tends to flare up when people feel less than good about the economy. And the history of the anti-immigration sentiment in this country generally tracks, not always, but often tracks what kind of shape the economy is in. And these days, for a lot of Americans, this is not an economy that is a good one. As all of you know, wages in this country for the bottom 60% certainly have stagnated. Virtually all of the income gains in this country have gone to the top 20%. That's okay if you're in a place like Massachusetts or maybe California, and you've got lots of technology and great educational institutions and so forth, but that's not necessarily the condition of most Americans. So I think a lot of what both Rachael and Bill described is quite understandable in the context of American political history. And of course, when people don't feel good, they tend to respond politically. Franklin Roosevelt was elected, I think we can agree, because the country was in a severe depression. Even Jack Kennedy in 1960, though I think Dwight Eisenhower left office in a reasonably popular way, we had a recession in Barry checked in 57, 58, and there were lingering impacts from that. The so-called stagflation of the 1970s, the fact that we were experiencing high rates of inflation at the same time that we were stagnating economically, unquestionably helped Ronald Reagan. There's no question about that. And the failure, I'm now shifting a little bit forward, and the failure of the Democratic Party to maintain its historic ties with white working Americans, and especially males, which didn't begin in the last few years, folks. The Reagan Democrats. 45% of the union members in this country voted for Ronald Reagan. So this is not a new phenomenon. But, for example, I think the Democratic failure to help working Americans understand how important the Affordable Care Act was, because we never told them that 80 to 85% of the uninsured people in this country are working or members of working families. To me, it was inexcusable. I just don't understand it. In fact, I got so upset at one point that I picked up the phone and called the White House, which I really do, needless to say, and talked to the press people there, and I said, look, I've been through this. We did pass a universal health care bill in this country, in this state when I was governor, and I did about 200 press events, and every one of them had a working person or working family on the stage with me. 80, 85% of the uninsured people in this country are working members of working families. They're not loafing, they're not sitting around, they're not on public assistance. If you're on welfare in this country, you get Medicaid. They don't have any health insurance, and they're working, many of them 2 or 3 jobs. And the young woman who I talked to, who was responsible for press coverage, it's very nice, she said to me, what's your source for that? And I said, it's the Bureau of the Census who reports to your boss, the President of the United States. It's all there. And about 2 or 3 days later, the President mentioned working people for the first time. She called me and said, did you hear that? I said, yeah, he's got to say it 20 times a day, and so do the Democrats in Congress. This is not a welfare program, but a lot of Americans think it is. And they think we're taking their money to take care of those people. So a lot of this discontent, in my opinion, has to do with shortcomings of the Democratic Party. And so I think, let me just say one other thing before wrapping up. I do think foreign policy, Chris, these days is having an impact as well. We're going to get into that in the course of this series, I hope. But the sense that American foreign policy is, if not incoherent, doesn't seem to have a sense of purpose. The kinds of interventions that are taking place, by the way, under administrations of both parties don't seem to be working. This was brought out for Kitty and me so clearly this past week when we visited a refugee camp just outside of Athens. Greece has 60,000 refugees, overwhelmingly Syrian, some Afghans, some Iraqis. And to Greece's credit, they've done a remarkable job in trying to provide for these folks who just washed up on the shore. 500,000 on my dad's home island, Lesbos alone. But I think people look at the world these days and say, you know, it's in chaos, and what's going on, and all of this terrorism, this kind of stuff. And I think it's having a profound impact. So for all of these reasons, we've got an interesting set of circumstances that are going to be with us for the next couple of months anyway as we go through this presidential campaign. And I think this is going to be a very tough and a very competitive, and by no means a race that's anywhere close to a foregone conclusion. So I think I'll stop at that point. You've got lots of questions, I'm sure. Let's get on.
One more questions. Yes, sir.
This is a question. The presidential debates that are upcoming. Can you review kind of the history of the ground rules of presidential debates and whether you believe that the debates that are upcoming will in fact only involve the two major party candidates?
You ever get that? Yes. Debates? Rachel, you want to take it?
I cannot review the rules of it, so I'm going to turn to my colleagues to do that, to do the history of it.
Put that on if you want.
Go. The history, is this on?
Yeah. Yes.
There you go.
You're good.
The history is roughly as follows. The very first set of debates between Kennedy and Nixon were organized by the networks. Between 1976 and 1988, they were organized by the League of Women Voters. Then, in part because of complaints that the 88 debates weren't exciting enough or something, they decided to create something called the Bipartisan Commission on Presidential debates, rather. And they are the people who have sponsored the debates ever since. In the very first go-around in 88, I believe it was, or in 88 before they did that, the League of Women Voters consulted some experts and came up with a rule that said they'd invite a third-party candidate if he or she had 15% of the vote. And that's kind of been the standard ever since. Ross Perot is the only third-party candidate ever to get invited to a presidential debate. That happened in 1992. It's worth saying he did not have anywhere close to 15% of the vote at the time he was invited. He was invited because, you may remember, he had dropped out of the race. He gets back into the race sometime in late September, if I remember. And at this point, the Bush people are about 10, 15 points down in the polls and going nowhere. And so they made a decision, I think short-sighted, but they made it nonetheless, that they would invite Perot into the debates. And so the moment he got in, they said, oh, we'll invite him into the debates. And Clinton, who actually, I think understood he would benefit from it, because Perot had very little negative to say about Clinton. He had lots negative to say about Bush. And therefore, the debates ended up almost to be a kind of a two-on-one thing. But he got invited in 1992. 1996, they didn't invite him. and they haven't invited anybody since then. And
When Trump said this week once that he would not participate unless the third and fourth party, the independents, were on the stage as well, do you think he was serious? Do you think that is likely to occur?
It's hard to know what Trump is serious about. He often says things off the top of his head and then retracts them later. I mean, that's the one way that they could get invited, is if, you know, Trump says, I insist that the candidates get in. It is quite possible that I mean, then the Clinton people have to say, do we look bad if we say no, we don't want them in? So they may end up being included this year.
There's no 15% rule currently.
Yeah.
There's no formal rule. It's just I mean, it's what the presidential, the bipartisan commission has always stood by.
Which is 15.
Which is 15.
And where are the libertarians? Close.
They're in most of the polls these days. They're around 7.
Yeah,
They you know, given the normal sampling error, they're up around 11, 12 in some polls, but averaging about 7. Was that enough of an answer? Yes.
So I have a question just more on the subject of the discontent that we've been talking about, and with all of the really inflammatory rhetoric that's been going on via Trump and others in this election cycle so far, and I'm from the state of Maine, where we have a really inflammatory governor currently, and I'm a Republican saying that, so that's what you know. I'm wondering how much more are we going to see of this nationwide? Are these political races going to turn into more of this total, you know, mudslinging, cuss words, this craziness, this zoo that we're seeing? Do you guys think we're going to see more of that post-Trump, or you know, it's concerning, I guess?
I think very sadly, yes. I think there's going to be, the Pandora's box has been opened in an even bigger way than it was before. And it seemed pretty ugly before, right? And books have been written about how horrible it is, and now it's at a fever pitch. And it has a corrosive effect in many ways. And it has a corrosive effect on particular groups as well, which is not to be diminished. So it is one of the things that is turning off a lot of young women from wanting to go into politics. It is having a corrosive effect on minorities and non-whites because they are the targets of it. It's having a terrible effect on children nationwide. There are lots of anecdotes, but the anecdotes are adding up. And there is research to back up at least the women and non-whites. So how we fix this is, I guess, a matter for another time. But I think it will be, but I do think at a certain point, perhaps I hope, that we will reach a level of exhaustion with this name-calling. That will lead to some soul-searching, but that's a hope.
Let me just say a couple of things, since I'm probably responsible for this. Because among other mistakes I made in 1988, one of them, it was my decision, nobody else's, was that I was not going to respond to the Bush attack campaign. And I don't have any question that it was only a big mistake. You just can't do that. Now, how you do it, how you develop a strategy for trying to deal with those attacks that don't end up with the two of you looking like a couple of kids in a sandbox throwing sand at each other is an interesting question, but nobody will make that mistake again. In fact, people don't remember that George H.W. Bush went after Clinton, if anything, harder than went after me. Nobody remembers that because Clinton and a lot of us, having learned from my demise, put together a unit in his campaigns. Matter of fact, some of the folks who worked for me were in this unit. And they called themselves the Defense Department. And all they did all day long was deal with the Bush attacks. In fact, they knew about them before they were going to make them and had responses ready to go. And so I think, whether one likes it or not, we're not going to somehow emerge in a much more pleasant and courteous way. Having said that, I just finished this remarkable biography of Alexander Hamilton. If you think this record is tough, read the biography of Hamilton and the Jefferson-Hamilton stuff. I mean, it was rough. And by the way, included lots of comments about the sex life of both of these guys, because both of them had an interesting sex life, which didn't emphasize fidelity among others. And in one case was interracial, at a time when that wasn't exactly the prevailing approach. So this is something that's been part of the history of the Republic from the beginning, and you know, we're still around. But I think you're going to have to somehow get accustomed to the fact that these are going to be very rough campaigns. Sorry.
Hi, I had a question regarding comparing the 2016 Republican primaries to the 2004 Democratic primaries. In the sense, 2004 had Howard Dean, did surprisingly well, but the campaigns came together and they stopped him in Iowa. Whereas in 2016, I was under the impression that the candidates were even ignoring Trump at times. You had the Marco Rubio, Chris Christie spat in New Hampshire, you had the case of Cruz collusion that fell apart. So my question is, why did this happen? Is this a failure within how the Republican Party is organized at the top levels? Was this a selfishness on behalf of the candidates? Why did they not come together in a united front and stop Donald Trump?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead. To begin, well, first of all, I would contest a little bit of the argument in the party decides about how the extent to which the party does these things. I mean, it may have a little bit of influence on the side, but Walter Mondale won because he was popular with a lot of Democratic groups and because he counterattacked against Gary Hart. Not because the supporting, and I would say the same about Hillary Clinton. She won less because of her support among party leadership and more because she had a real level of support with blacks that, in particular, that Bernie Sanders did not have. So I think the other thing that if I were to add one more factor to my explanation of Trump is that they didn't take him seriously enough until much too late. And there wasn't, as I did say, there wasn't an obvious person to rally around if you wanted to oppose him. If Trump had run against somebody like, say, George W. Bush in 2000, when he had just an incredible level of support from other party leaders and was doing very well in the polls, there would have been that kind of a counterattack. There wasn't an obvious person to rally around this time.
I guess I would just add that the other thing is when candidates are loath to collude too much because they want to win as well. So their desire to connect and look the same, there's no incentive to do that.
This kind of piggybacks on that question. I was going to ask about the larger candidates and if that's symptomatic of a larger problem within the GOP, and is that because of weak political leadership in the GOP? Is that why there was 17 different candidates and why there was no one person to really bear the torch? And also on the other question that you had, is this going to continue? Is there going to be a further disintegration of party leadership or what seemingly seems like party leadership, and also the demonization of kind of political professionals in general, and what that means, I guess specifically for the GOP.
Well, as I said, I'm not sure that I think the extent to which the party leadership controlled the nomination under the new rules that were passed in 1972 has been exaggerated in some recent writing. I think today you win the nomination by winning the primaries. And getting an endorsement from somebody may help you a little bit at the margins, but not that much. And so I'm not sure that parties are that much weaker than they were a little while, 10 years ago. I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
It was just about leadership and how there wasn't, it seems that even with Paul Ryan kind of reluctantly coming into the speakership, and there's really no kind of anybody to look to in the GOP to really bear the torch. And what's that, is there deeper symptoms of that? Do you see that that's going to change?
I think it's fair to say that activists in the parties often feel that the established leadership is not aggressive enough in pushing their positions. I mean, I think that's one of the explanations for the Sanders campaign, is that there were a whole lot of Democrats who they might not have wanted to attack Obama by name, but they would say, you know, we haven't gone far enough. And that's, you know, we did bail out the banks, and we have Obamacare, but we don't have single payer, and we have, you know, a long list of other things. But I do think that, I mean, the level of dissatisfaction among the Republican base really is, conceding all that, pretty remarkable. And I think a lot of it, again, does go back to the Bush administration, which I've always argued that the Tea Party is as much a reaction against Bush as it is against Obama. That a whole lot of Republicans said, we elected this guy, and he dramatically expanded the federal government's role in education. He created a new entitlement program. He inherited a government that had a $200 billion surplus and very quickly turned it into a huge deficit. You know, on and on and on, that he wasn't the conservative we thought we were electing. And that probably explains a lot of why the Republican leadership has lost its credibility with the Republican electorate, or with substantial parts of it.
Over to that side.
Yes, thank you. My question is about Democrats and Democrats. I'm sorry I missed your presentation, Professor Cobb, go Suffolk. But I wonder if the side of the field, I mean, there were many Republicans, many opportunities for Republicans to contrast and talk about the party, not so much with Hillary Clinton, with her perhaps one rival. But do you think that the reason she's not, my first part of my question is it possible that one of the reasons she's not doing better is because she didn't have that, you know, opportunity with many rounds of candidates to deal with, to present herself? And secondly, this is the Democrats versus Democrats. Governor, you were a very different Democrat than she is. Maybe you were more of a Democrat when she was younger, a younger person. She was more a person of the people. She hasn't driven a car in 30 years. You rode the T. You really are the son of immigrants. I mean, your presentation of yourself was very different. She doesn't have that opportunity to present herself as a more traditional Democrat. So anyway, it was a question of, a two-part question of whether she didn't have as many opportunities to distinguish herself, and whether or not she may be a Democrat that doesn't relate as well to people these days.
Well, I guess I would say that I'm a little hesitant to say that if any other Democrat were running, they would be trouncing, because the country, I mean, first of all, there really is division in the country between Republicans and Democrats, and there are a sizable number of both. And reasonably, people who identify with their party and who have inherited their visions of what this country should look like are going to naturally go to that set of candidates that supports it. So I think that she is unpopular. There is no question about it. So would a different Democrat perhaps be doing better? Yes, a lot better. At that one, I'm not so sure.
I forgot to add squeaky clean. I'm sorry, Governor, you were squeaky clean.
But Obama is.
But I lost.
And I would argue Obama is too. And he has not, I mean, he's recently enjoying an upsurge in popularity, but there's been not a scandal in that administration.
Oh,
I mean,
I disagree.
Well, there have been other challenges, but I wouldn't say they are of the size of the scandals of others. Well, okay, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I just think there's been a lot of scandals that haven't been well publicized, they haven't received the attention they would have if they had occurred under a Republican administration. It's clear they have done a lot of things in connection with the treaty with Iran, that they have lied about it in ways that if Bush had done it, the Fast and Furious gun scandal never received anything like the attention. All of the subsidies that they gave to favored contributors like Solyndra, all of those things could easily have been publicized, and by and large were not. I'm sorry?
They were, especially.
Oh, not anywhere near the extent that the similar sorts of things were.
What about Fox News?
I'm sorry?
Fox News did it every single day.
Well, yeah, but not that many people. Not that many people listen to Fox News. I agree. Fox News, I agree, goes after that stuff, but not ABC, not NBC, not CBS, not CNN, not the Washington Post, not the New York Times.
Let me just say a few things. I don't disagree with what Bill said, but not too long ago, if you look at the national polls, Hillary Clinton was the most admired public figure in America, particularly when she was Secretary of State. So what happened there? Now, some of this obviously was her own fault. You know, if you're going to run for office, then keep the speaking fees moderate. In fact, don't accept it. But there's been an industry based in Orlando, Florida, folks, for the past 4 years, financed by right-wing money, whose sole purpose has been to bring that woman down. And they've been, and I would say this, it's just a matter of fact. I mean, I think this email thing is the biggest crock I've ever heard. Because at least two of our predecessors had exactly the same information. By the way, supervised by the State Department.
No.
Supervised by the State Department. This was not done kind of in the backyard someplace. And, you know, it's been very effective. So, you know, you've got all these things floating around, and I think it has had a lot to do with, I think she's by no means blameless, as I pointed out. But, you know, the Benghazi thing has to be, I mean, $7 million was spent on that investigation, and a Republican committee exonerated her. But it's backing today, thanks to Congressman from Utah happens to be my son's half-brother. So there's been a lot of this stuff, and don't get me wrong, I mean, people are throwing this stuff around all over the place, but this is the result of a very very concerted effort to bring her down. And in my opinion, a lot of it is quite unfair, and a lot of it is really quite inaccurate.
Okay, next question.
So, my question is open to anyone. I'm just looking for an answer. It draws particularly from the arguments of Governor Dukakis and Professor Mayer. And I think you both made very lucid arguments as to why a Trump figure would win in a year like this. But you're both political scientists, and I don't want to speak for Governor Dukakis, but Professor Mayer started right off by saying, I didn't see this coming, and I'm a political scientist. Now, Donald Trump really isn't a politician, much less of a political scientist. And he ran for president in the past, in 2000, on the Reform Party, and he hardly made a dent in a very memorable year. He's been dallying with a run ever since. You know, there's always a news cycle every year. Oh, is Donald Trump going to run? And it looks like he's been looking for the right time. And obviously he declared and won the nomination. So, why did Donald Trump pick this year? Is my question.
Well, I declined to try reading Donald Trump's mind. But I would say, I mean, he clearly has a very high opinion of his own abilities and his own capacity to do well in the job. He's been flirting with it, as you said. I don't think he actually ran in 2000. No. Who was the Reform? Do you know who was the Reform Party candidate in 2000? It was Pat Buchanan.
Yes, we were in the nomination process, is what I think.
He may have flirted with it, but I don't think he ever formally announced. He's, you know, I'm by no means a Trump fan. I've had two op-ed pieces published in the Herald recently, and one of which I explained why I could never vote for Trump. And incidentally, to get back to the point somebody made, one reason is because it really would, I think, send a signal that you can just do deplorable things in the course of the campaign and still get elected. But the second was why I could never vote for Hillary. But he does clearly have some things on the ball. He knows how to attract media coverage. He knows how to kind of present himself as somebody who's, you know, kind of take charge, I'm in command sort of guy. I mean, in a certain way, he dominated a lot of those debates. You know, none of this means I think he'd make a good president, but you know, he does. He's good at attracting attention, and you know, given, as I say, all of the given all of the problems with Hillary Clinton, most of which I think are real. I think the email scandal is something significant. I think her failures in regards to Benghazi are really serious. I think the level of corruption in the Clinton Foundation is amazing. I keep going on. You know, as I say, I think if she were running against Joe Biden, if he were running against Joe Biden, he'd be down by 6-8 points minimum.
I guess one thing I would add is, and this is speculation, I think Trump, I mean, why 2016 was your question, why not prior? He did gain momentum in his claims against Obama about being the birther thing. And I think there has been a fomenting, as Governor Dukakis noted, of anti-immigration sentiment, and there is, inequality has increased and continues to increase. So the kinds of economic conditions and the fragile state that many Americans are finding themselves in right now feeds into a kind of person who is going to scapegoat and find particular groups to blame.
Jump over there.
One of the problems is that no one stood up to this bully. I think we all know in our lives when there are bullies and you stand up, that bully wilts. And I saw that during the whole Republican process. My question is this: how can we have two candidates that are historically unpopular, and two candidates that could not receive so-called their party nomination, that on either side, John Kasich clearly would beat Hillary Clinton, Bernard Sanders would clearly beat Donald Trump. Why are they not the nominees? We have a failure of the democratic process here. I'd like to have people talk about this. How can we be electing, and what does this mean for governance when you're electing people with 60% above, not just disapproval, but absolute rejection?
Well, let me first question some of the assumptions here. Kitty will never forget Bernie Sanders from endorsing Jesse Jackson over me in 1988, so she won't be part of this discussion. But I question very seriously whether Bernie Sanders would be winning as a party nominee. Because Sanders has had an interesting career, and by the way, I have a lot of, I'd rather have him with it. But he's got speeches about what a great guy Fidel Castro is, and he's said a lot of other things. And my sense, Bill, was that Rachael, the Republicans were just itching to get their hands on this guy.
The silence spoke volumes.
I mean, it just, you know, he would be the subject of a devastating attack campaign. And I think he would have been quite successful. So don't make the assumption that he would have won easily. I'm inclined to agree with Bill. If Joe Biden were the nominee, I think it might be 10 or 12 points rather than 6 or 8. But he's a very different guy from Bernie Sanders, and I think has strong appeal to blue collar Democrats that neither Bernie nor apparently Hillary does. So you never know these things, but this is by no means a cut and dry election on who we're talking about here.
Can I just add in one, because I agree with you about it, these are two really quite deplorable candidates. The only thing I would add to that is that's what the voters nominated. I mean, that's why they're there.
Did they?
Yes.
Some of my data is still up there. I could, Trump won 14 million votes, dramatically more than anybody else did. Hillary won 3 million more votes than Bernie did. I mean, I think most of the scandals that Hillary has gotten blamed for are real. One that isn't real is the claim that the Democratic Party rigged the process in her favor. They tried to do it, to be sure, but she won anyway. That's not why she won. She won because more Democrats favored her than Sanders, and I also agree with Michael that Sanders has his poll numbers are misleadingly good right now because nobody ever really went after him on a dozen different things that the Republicans in particular would love to have hammered him on.
Hi, I want to thank you all for this. It's been really enlightening. I appreciate it. I do have a concern. I wanted to get your views on how the Trump campaign has unleashed this rage and anger that a lot of us were not aware of. And regardless of who wins the presidency, what is going to happen to this license for really kind of vicious, scary behavior, and how do we address that as a society now that we know that this kind of sentiment has been tapped into on both the Democrat and the Republican side? Thank you.
Well, as Governor Dukakis said, you know, we have survived vicious attacks and terrible times before with all of this, and these things do come in waves. At the end of the day, I also think that once the election is over and pending, I mean, we've had disasters around elections. So pending that we don't have a recount, all of that, and all of the candidates can agree that the election was decided by the American people in an honest and fair way. I think that is a concern at the moment, though. And there are many people who study election administration who are very concerned about a number of things, especially that Trump has said about the system being rigged. And exactly what we're going to see. I mean, there are concerns about, you know, recounts and machine failures and hurricanes and all of those kinds of things. So you know, all of that is unpredictable. But at the end of the day, once the election is over, it is over. And there is a certain national turning a new page and looking to the new administration. And the vigor and anger of the campaign does subside as the media attention turns to the transition and to the new policy proposals and the new administration. And there will be plenty to talk about after that, especially about what happens with the Supreme Court, et cetera.
I want to ask my two colleagues a question before we wrap up. I have a sense that the debates, and especially the first debate, are going to be very important. Do you share that view? And can you talk a little bit about how you think that might play out and why?
I think it's going to get a lot of ratings, the first one. I think, you know, there is debate within many circles about the importance of debates and whether they simply reinforce pre-existing views or whether they actually change minds. Obama had some bad performances. He still won. So I think that people can recover from them, but not if you do it poorly a few times.
You know, in general, I think it's fair to say the debates have not been decisive in most elections. I mean, it's usually there's a build-up. Oh, this is the make or break moment, and it turns out. But this is a very close election, and if Trump, for example, can succeed in convincing people he's not the crazy man that a whole lot of us think he really is, it might. I mean, you know, Reagan had that one debate with Carter, and going in, a lot of it was the question: do people think Reagan is a lightweight?
At the time.
Well, lightweight, but also somebody who's dangerous. I mean, I think they were less worried about his being not so smart as having his finger on the button. And he performed in a way that reassured a whole lot of people and took an election that looked like it was going to be close, and it turned into a remarkable, you know, near landslide. There's certainly an opening there, but yes, I mean, at least one thing I can guarantee is that most Trump people will think Trump won the debate, and most Clinton people will think Clinton won the debate.
And those differences between partisans over these things have widened over the past few years. So, and this is true actually of electoral outcomes in general, that people who lost think that it was rigged And people who won think that it was done fair and square.
We're up there and way there.
So given Clinton's general unpopularity with the population, why was there such a lineup within like the Democratic Party support? Was it just her experience within the party?
Say again.
So why did the Democratic Party line up behind Clinton, given that she really was so unpopular with the general population?
There has been a change in her popularity ratings for sure, from time 1 to time 2, and she had been a, what we might say, a high-quality candidate in 2008 in that she had come very close. And there were a lot of Democrats who, so I mean, in terms of the exact timing of when the endorsements came and the money and the polling, she had a lot of that going into it, and so the candidates that you might expect to step in decided to not step in because it seemed clear that she had this significant power going in based on her performance in 2008. So I think it's really a matter of who stepped back and who decided not to go in based on that. Because as you know, any ambitious politician is going to choose their moment very carefully to make sure, they're not putting themselves on the line to lose quickly or to lose at all.
Can I add to that? Let me just add a quick thing. Whatever Clinton's unpopularity with the general public was, remember, this was a party election. The popularity among fellow Democrats, registered Democrats, was actually reasonably high.
The only other quick thing I would add is that one of the effects of the Republican victories in the 2010 and 2014 midterm elections was to wipe out an awful lot of the Democratic base. Not base, but farm team, if you will. The possible people. The same thing happened to the Republicans when they lost so badly in 2006 and 2008. The result was they had a very weak set of people running for president in 2012. If Romney hadn't been there, Newt might have gotten it.
Okay, last question.
So popularity seems to be a big theme. For all the people that say they can't vote for Trump but they can't vote for Hillary, what does that do then to the final election? And then I just have to ask, a woman, how does Hillary being a woman impact the race as well?
So, and the first piece is all of these people who are going to sit out. I don't think a lot of people are going to sit out. I think there were people who said they were going to sit, and some people will. Okay, there are people who will. But in terms of the numbers of people who typically vote, they are going to vote. The impact of her being a woman, I think actually is yet to be imagined. I think it will be bigger than many people feel it now. And that will, what?
Pro or con?
In a positive way.
But that's only if she gets elected.
Right.
Is it affecting her?
Is it affecting her electability?
And people wanting to vote for her because
there is a strain that her gender in some ways is challenging for many Americans. At the same time, what's been interesting, and I don't know if anybody's read this research about her language having shifted over time, and that she's become much more like a man in how she presents herself and how she uses pronouns. It's very interesting research. So she has been able to join the club in a certain way, and so I mean, but I think there's a big thing about being the first. After that, it normalizes it.
Just in terms of what happens to people who don't like either Hillary or Trump, some fair number of them will swallow their dissatisfaction and vote for their party's candidate anyway. But the other thing that's clearly happening is a lot of these people are going to vote for third-party candidates. I mean, I've mentioned that the Libertarians are averaging about 7% of the polls right now. It's important to say that the Libertarian high point prior to this year was 1% in 1980. So they're running 7 times higher than they've ever been before. And 1980 incidentally was a huge exception. In most recent years, the Libertarians have gotten about half of 1%. And similarly with the Green Party. I mean, Jill Stein is at about 3% in the typical poll right now. Nader got 2.5%. But only in 2000. By 2004, it was down to again like 0.5% or something like that.
Well, I'm going to ask my three colleagues to offer any final concluding thoughts before we wrap up.
I've just thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. I hope you have too. We're delighted at the turnout, but there are still seats available. So if you enjoyed this as much as I did, I hope you'll invite lots of people to come and join us, because this is going to get better and better as time goes on, and I think my two colleagues have done a hell of a job. So thank you.
I'd like to echo thanks to Rachael Cobb and Bill Mayer for their presentations. Thank you for coming. Next week, the economy. My friend Barry Bluestone, colleague Steve Ellis, will be here to talk about the economy, jobs, and opportunity. Come back. For those of you who didn't get a chance to ask questions tonight, I'll put you one first.
In 2 weeks.
2 weeks from now, we'll talk about immigration. 2 weeks from now, immigration and what it means to be American. So next week, the economy, 2 weeks, immigration. Get them the good stuff. See you next week.
I just got back from Greece. I went to Michael.
Wait a second, I gotta take the cake. I gotta take the cake. Hold on, I gotta find out where we eat.
We're eating at Darrow's.
Going into town?
It's going into town. I'll come with you.
Aren't you in here?
No, I don't believe it.
Where'd he go?
Governor. Hi. I think the Sanders campaign. Great. I was trying to say that's a failure of democracy. I understand. So, but he's one of the people of principle not gone over the top. Yeah, which I have to give the man credit for.
That's true. That's true.
Hi, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm a first-year poli-sci freshman, so it's scary.
Welcome.
I'm from Monmouth, Massachusetts.
Hey.
Hi, Governor. How are you?
I thought I heard a familiar voice. Okay.
Yeah, I heard you doing more too. And I was like, yeah, you did actually. You did really great.
Hey. Moira.
1, 2, 3. 5 more. 1, 2,
Goma
3.
Goma Mia.
One more. Good, that's good.
Where did you go? With that, of course, never read it. Never been. Next time I went there and I went to the festival. That was beautiful. Yeah, it was fantastic. So I went down, what a drop, please. I am from here. We are the